Similar to any art form or craft, you'll find that there are always a few products, people, or things that lead the way of influence for many that follow afterwards. Watches are not exempt from this. So today we are going to be looking at 10 of the most imitated and sometimes straight up copied designs in all of watchmaking. So a few things before we begin. Obviously, imitation and taking some inspiration from another design is not necessarily a bad thing. My hope for this video is to simply analyze what and why these watch designs are so influential, and also why they are constantly looked at for inspiration. Also, I don't want this to be a game of what came first, what came second. That's not the approach here. I'm looking more at watches that were important to developing design principles that you'll see in other places around the industry. And I bring that up because similar to a genre of music, there's a difference between being the first and being the thing, or say band in that instance, that popularized that sound. In this case, what popularized that design in watchmaking. So the first 8 watches on this list are going to be more precise models, with the final 2 being more styles and design approaches from specific brands. So if you were to test yourself on how many luxury watch brands you could name without looking at any other places online or looking at any tools, how many would you guess? If you would say under 50, then you need to check out our top luxury watch brands article. We just updated it for 2024. This includes brands from a variety of different nations, information on their founding, and we'll also include quick fun facts about each brand mentioned. Like, for example, did you know that flight pioneers Orville and Wilbur Wright were actually customers and proud owners of Vacheron Constantin watches? Or did you know that the Vatican in Rome maintains one of the largest collections of JLC Atmos clocks in the world? If that sounds interesting to you, check out the link in the description down below to the article. So the first watch we have here, this is an easy one for me, and I think many would agree with this one. This is the Cartier Tank. Now, Cartier didn't necessarily invent the rectangular case. That is not true. But if you are looking at watch design and what was able to make that a popular concept, I think you would have to look at the Cartier Tank as being one of the most crucial designs that pushed that forward. Originally prototyped in 1917, the Cartier Tank was slow to roll, including in 1919 when it was released to the public to a very small production amount. And until the 20th century, you didn't really see the massive scale of what the Cartier Tank would ultimately become. However, it did rise in its popularity as a result of stars in Hollywood and beyond that famously wore the Tank. This design is so strong that now when many brands approach a rectangular case, they'll just say it's a Cartier Tank type of spin-off. And then if you fuse in any Roman numerals, it's game over. Everyone's going to look. And I think that is the case for pretty much every rectangular case watch out there. They'll always get lumped in with the Cartier Tank, apart from the Reverso, which has its own history and backstory and unique case to go along with it. But of those 2 watches, what is more copied? Obviously, it's the Cartier Tank. Also, you'll have that blue sapphire topped crown or blue spinel crown that you'll find that I think also we can probably associate mostly with Cartier, and definitely has been followed by others in the industry. And even just the Roman numerals themselves, another thing you'll see is it's not even just the use of Roman numerals. I don't think that's the element of the design that gets copied. It's the warping and stretching of those numerals and how they appear across that rectangular dial and case shape. So this next one is not as definitive as others, but certainly there are a lot of brands that will pull from this design. This is the Omega Speedmaster. Now the Speedmaster has taken a lot of different forms over the years. If you look at the original 1957 design DNA, I think there's a couple things that I would call out as being very influential and also probably borrowed across the industry. One thing that we have to look at is the broad arrow hand. That has become synonymous with Omega, and I think they were the reason that has become popularized. And we've seen it from the likes of micro brands to other brands in the industry. I think what's responsible for that is these early 1957 trilogy models and making this more popular. You also have the turn lug design that is something that is emblematic of the Speedmaster family, some of the bracelet styles, but also the register layout and the tachometer scale on the external bezel. Back in the late 1950s, this wasn't a given to just put your tachometer scale on the external bezel. I would say that Omega Speedmaster was partially responsible for the popularization of that design that we probably now just take for granted for pretty much every chronograph that we see with the tachometer scale. So there's no brand that has imitated more than Rolex. And that is why I have 4 Rolex watches. I tried to pick the 4 Rolex watches that I feel are copied from the most, imitated the most, and maybe inspired the most designs in the industry. The first one, I would argue, is maybe the most influential or one of the most influential designs of all time. This is the Rolex Datejust. Now, we always think about the Submariner, which we'll get to that in a moment, but the Datejust has so many firsts that it delivered to the industry, or at least brought forth so many designs that we now associate back to the Datejust. I don't think it's thought about enough. In 1945, this was made to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the brand, but I would argue that it is probably one of the most recognizable designs that you'll find in all of watchmaking. And also, the design itself has so many elements that have now been infused into other designs that now we know of as Rolex elements and approaches. I mean, one concept is the fluted bezel. I mean, now if any brand tries a fluted bezel, it seems like Rolex has ownership over the fluted bezel because of the Datejust design. And they did almost perfect it, I think, over the years with just how they approach a fluted bezel. It's eye-catching, it's elegant, and just beautifully executed. Another massive point we have to bring up is the Jubilee. The Datejust was the vehicle that made popular the Jubilee. And how many brands have a bracelet that, sure, they might not be able to get away with classifying and calling it a Jubilee, but it looks like a Jubilee bracelet. Any fine link bracelet in the industry nowadays, it feels like it has a lot of elements borrowed from the Jubilee bracelet. Then you have the Cyclops. Nowadays, you can associate the Cyclops with a lot of different designs, but I would say it was the watch that really allowed the Cyclops to catch on. And with its simple date at 3 o'clock and bringing that forward, I mean, it's called the Datejust, it was a watch that really pushed forward that as being a key design trait for Rolex more broadly. Now, next up, this is a watch that I promised we'd get to, and we are going to get to it. This is the Rolex Submariner. This is the most copied design in watchmaking history. I don't think anybody can debate us about this. I've always brought up that many of the feelings, that maybe negative feelings somebody might have towards the Submariner, or some of them, have been brought up because you see the Submariner in other places, not all directly coming from Rolex. This design is so popular, I can look at the crown guards, I can look at the bezel, I can look at this watch from across the room. In the silhouette of this design, I know it's a Submariner, or at least I know it's a brand trying to look like the Submariner. And it was also among the first dive watches in the world, and being among the first, it is also going to be responsible for many of the characteristics that we now associate with dive watches. The other one you have to put here is the Rolex Daytona. The strange thing about the Daytona is I feel as if it's been more imitated in the last 10 years than it was maybe the first 50 years of its run in the industry. It's just crazy how this watch has now become the poster child of the whole watch hype craze that we saw years ago. And last decade is really responsible for a lot of this getting pushed forward, and even the popularization of things like a Paul Newman dial. You'll see this in other places, or at least see some inspiration. How the ceramic bezel and Rolex's approach to it with a dial design that Daytona has also being mirrored across the industry. So with its success has come a lot of this imitation, and you know, they say that's the highest form of flattery. And then there's one other watch I wanted to include here from Rolex, and it's just because this watch has become synonymous with the type and genre of watch itself. This is the Rolex GMT Master. If you have this exercise, and I think I did it when I covered this watch and reviewed it, the modern GMT Master 2, you close your eyes and you think about what a sports GMT should look like. To me, the first thing I think of is the Rolex GMT Master with its bicolor bezel. That genre, that style. I mean, is there any other watch style in the entire industry that one watch can have that much of a stranglehold on? Think about chronographs, so many great chronographs. Think about field watches, a lot of great field watches, pilot watches, a lot of great pilot watches. But a GMT, there are a lot of great GMT watches, but how definitive is the Rolex GMT Master 2? Also, how copied is that bicolor bezel that we see? It was also a watch design that was popularizing the use of Jubilee. We talked about that earlier with the Datejust. This was another watch that was one of the early experimenters with that bracelet design. Also just the rotating bezel itself, how the positioning of the hours were displayed on that bezel. The GMT hand with that triangle tip. We see the Cyclops again. To me, this is very easily one of the most copied watches of all time. Moving right along, we are going to look at the steel integrated sports watch, and this has gone nuts in the last 5 to 10 years, especially, and kind of having this resurgence and so much more appreciation, and I think now appealing to so many people because of what this watch represents for everyday viability. And if you're trying to pinpoint who is responsible for this craze, where can we all look back to? Well, we look back to 1972 with the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak. This is the watch. If you're thinking about an integrated watch and what started it all, what is the most copied of all the integrated sports watches, this is it. This is the granddaddy of them all when it comes to it. I think this is a responsibility of a few things. One is the whole Gerald Genta story in connection, the lore around how it was designed and all the backstory of how he's designing it and late at night the day before he has to deliver the design, and it was just this thing that came together and came to motion so beautifully and quickly. All of that adds to it. But then you have the design itself, this integrated sports design. And remember, at the time, having this elevated luxury watch with steel was not something that was seen the same way it is today. That was more of a novel concept back then, especially when this was the first time that this integrated look was done to this degree. A couple other things that I'll mention is just the bracelet styling, how the bracelet looks. How often do we now see people trying to imitate the Royal Oak bracelet? You can also look at the octagonal design of the case itself, what that bezel is going to look like. You see that quite often in the industry, and I would say now the Royal Oak has almost ownership over that design because of how popular it's been. It's tapisserie dial. You also have the screws on the bezel. That's another design characteristic of this that you'll see elsewhere. They were not the first to have this kind of ornate presentation of the screws and this industrialized look, but they were one that definitely popularized it in many ways. That is not the only integrated steel sports watch on this list. I'd say the only other one that I would say is copied near the Royal Oak, but not maybe as much, and this is also probably more recent. I think if you looked at the Royal Oak in its totality and how long it's existed, it's probably been copied more, but in the last 10 years, it's probably a toss-up between these two. This is the Patek Philippe Nautilus. The Nautilus was created in 1976, another Genta creation, which probably adds to it, but the thing I will call attention to here is going to be the dial. It has a very unique kind of line pattern that we'll see elsewhere in the industry, and if you do it, people are going to call you out for looking like a Nautilus, but the other area is just going to be the case silhouette. You have this crown guard position and how it looks on the 3 o'clock side of the case, and then the opposing side at the 9 o'clock has this kind of protrusion, and how it looks on that side has become iconic with its silhouette. You also have that bolstered bezel with the line brushing on the top surface and then the polishing on the sides. These are all some of the design characteristics. No question, a very imitated watch, and I would say an imitated watch more so even in the last decade. So those were the individual watches. Now I want to look at a couple different watch styles and designs by two specific brands that I think are pulled from in a variety of places around the industry. First are Seiko divers. Now, I didn't have a specific Seiko diver to call out because I think the things that we are finding with other dive watches is that it comes a little bit from here, a little bit from there. You can look at the SKX. I mean, how many other watches look like a SKX silhouette? How many other watches look like a turtle silhouette with its rounded case? The 62 Mas kind of skin diver approach, that's something that I also see elsewhere. The tuna case, anything with that rounded, almost just circle type of design, it looks like a tuna can. I mean, that is owned by the Seiko tuna. Also hand styles. The arrow hand for the minute hand, I think, is something that's become popularized by Seiko. But a big thing I would call attention to is the 4 o'clock crown. Now, I don't know the exact history of what was the first 4 o'clock crown, and I probably should look into that a little bit more, but could we agree that Seiko was the brand that truly popularized the 4 o'clock crown and has become a key part of the dive watch DNA that they have developed and probably has as good a history of any in the entire industry of producing dive watches. And that is one of the core elements, I think, of what makes a Seiko dive watch so recognizable. It just felt so appropriate to put them on this list. I know it's not a specific dive watch, but I think many of us can agree potentially that they are incredibly influential in this category. And then one other genre of watch that I want to mention, it's kind of just two genre of watches, Patek Philippe calendar, perpetual calendar watches, and then also calendar chronographs. This whole arena is, in my eye, very similar to how I looked at the GMT Master 2. When I think of a perpetual calendar, when I think of a perpetual calendar chronograph especially, I will often think of Patek Philippe. They were the first to create a perpetual calendar wristwatch in 1925, and they also were very important in developing the design style that we now think of for the dial layout of many of these early perpetuals and their perpetual calendar layout. I think part of the mesmerizing idea of a perpetual calendar, beyond just what it's doing technically, is just the layout and the romantic idea of how balanced it can be with all of these different measurements that you need, elements of time, while doing it in a clean way. We owe that in many ways to Patek Philippe. They also were responsible for the first perpetual calendar chronograph in 1941. And the 1518, I mean, that is seen as a holy grail of many Patek collectors, and a design that we see now being pulled from a variety of different places. Many of these calendar watches from Patek Philippe are such standouts and have been so important to this genre and complication type that you sometimes don't think about it as much, because these are now seen as these grail watches and they're not as front and center because it's hard to pull off this level of complication, high complication type. But to me, they have influenced countless other takes on the perpetual calendar and calendar functions in years and years that followed after what they were putting forth in the earlier part of the 20th century. But all right, guys, that's my video here today, looking at some of the most copied, imitated, and most influential watches to ever be created. Is there another watch that you would have included on this list? I thought I could maybe stretch it a little bit more, but I didn't know where I should make the cutoff, and these just felt like some standouts that made the most sense. If you do have another option or pick that you would have, leave a comment down below. Also, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, hit the bell icon. Really do appreciate that. I know I just say that at the end of every video, but it does mean a lot and helps out the channel and helps out this video and being seen by more people, so do appreciate that. Also check out TeddyBalthasar.com, full authorized dealer of 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and a full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.